Hi, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. I'd like to thank you for taking the time to join me on today's video. On today's video, we're continuing with our ongoing series entitled Prove the Complexity Factors. And today, we're in session number 6 with only one more session after this to go. And today I have a fascinating discussion for you. In today's discussion, we're going to make real and we're going to make concrete many of the intellectual and philosophic ideas that we've discussed so far. And in today's session, I'm going to show you how in the body of your report, you actually prove to the parties that your use of the complexity factors deserve and qualify to be reimbursed in their entirety so that you can expect payment in full for every minute that you spent on the evaluation. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple minutes, but before we get into the meat of the matter of today's discussion, I want to take just a couple minutes to review with you where we've come from so far so that we're all up to speed on the topics contained within this discussion series. In video number 1, we talked about how now, more than ever, it's required and essential that you be able to prove to the parties that your use of the complexity factors complies and comports with the exact language of the law, at least as it's described as it exists today under CCR 9795. Now, throughout this discussion series, we've talked about how CCR 9795 is expected or could change in the very near future, and we've talked about how to address some of those changes should those changes come to pass. But regardless, and as a general philosophy, regardless of what happens to the exact language of the complexity factors, no matter what the language says, it's always going to be essential that you comply with the language as it exists at the time. And number 2, it's going to be essential that you be able to prove that you complied with the exact letter of the language as it exists at the time. So regardless of where the language ends up, it's always going to be necessary for you to prove to the parties that your use of the complexity factors, whatever they may be, your use of the complexity factors deserves to be reimbursed because you comply and comport with the exact language of the law, however that law may exist at the time. So if that's true, if it's necessary that you be able to prove and document to the parties that your use of the complexity factors deserves to be reimbursed, it's essential that the sections of your report wherein you address the complexity factors, those sections of your report should be the masterpiece sections of your report. Those are the most critical sections of your report. Those are the sections of your report upon which your greatest attention is deserved, okay? So the causation section of your report should be a masterpiece. The review of records section of your report should be a masterpiece. The apportionment section of your report should be reflective of your greatest intellectual work. And these sections of your report are the critical sections because these are the sections of the report that the parties are going to turn to when they review your billing. Okay? So these sections of your report are critical. In session number 2, we started talking about how to prove the complexity factors. And we divided the complexity factors into those complexity factors that you can establish and prove prior to the face-to-face evaluation, those complexity factors that you can establish and prove during the face-to-face evaluation, and finally those complexity factors that you can establish and prove after the face-to-face evaluation. So in session number 2, we talked about the review of records and causation complexity factors and how to establish and at least begin to prove those even before the face-to-face evaluation with the examinee. In other words, these complexity factors have a great deal that you can do even prior to meeting with the examinee face-to-face. So these two complexity factors can largely be shored up even before seeing the examinee. In session 3, we continued with the complexity factors that can be established prior to the face-to-face evaluation, and also we began to discuss those complexity factors that are established at the face-to-face evaluation. And perhaps most importantly of all, we talked about the complexity factor that deals with a prior written agreement. Prior written agreement. The prior written agreement complexity factor supersedes all other complexity factors. It's the big daddy of the complexity factors. So in those cases that you truly believe involve extraordinary circumstances, it's extremely valuable for you to be able to obtain a prior written agreement from the parties, because when you obtain a prior written agreement from the parties, it obviates or negates the need to establish any of the other complexity factors. So once you obtain a prior written agreement from the parties that your evaluation involves extraordinary circumstances, it then becomes unnecessary to prove review of records as a complexity factor. It then becomes unnecessary to prove face-to-face time as a complexity factor. It then becomes unnecessary to prove causation and apportionment as complexity factors, because the prior written agreement supersedes all other complexity factors. In session 4, we started to talk about the complexity factors that can be established after the face-to-face evaluation. Well, the complexity factors that need to be completed at the face-to-face evaluation, and then also complexity factors that are established after the face-to-face evaluation. And we focused mainly on your interview and interrogation techniques related to, number 1, apportionment, and number 2, related to prior multiple injuries, and how to nail down and firmly establish those complexity factors through your interviewing techniques with the examinee. And we also talked about the importance and the necessity of doing an EAMS search on your examinee prior to the face-to-face evaluation, because it's the EAMS search that may unearth a prior history of industrial injuries that you otherwise may not be made aware of by the parties through either your cover letters or through the medical records that you received. In fact, sometimes by the time you see the examinee in the face-to-face evaluation, you're the only person doing any work on the case. It's not until many times after you submit your QME report that you then get in new information regarding the examinee's prior history, and then you then get in a request for a supplemental report to address this new information. But what I'm recommending and suggesting to you is that you do an EAMS search in advance of the face-to-face evaluation so that you can be armed with the necessary history that will guide your interview and interrogation techniques in the face-to-face evaluation, so that you can capture apportionment as a complexity factor, and so that you can capture prior multiple injuries as a complexity factor the first time that you meet with the examinee face-to-face. Okay? So that was some key insiders information that I hope you take to heart there for your very next evaluation. And then finally, in our last session, which was session number 5, we talked about 2 things. Number 1, how to prove medical research as a complexity factor. And then we also talked about the complexity factor related to 6 or more hours spent on any combination of 3 or more complexity factors. And just to say a couple words about medical research before we get into today's discussion, the purpose of medical research, and this is actually described in law in California Code of Regulation 9793. It tells us in that regulation what is the purpose of medical research. And as it turns out, the purpose of medical research is to help resolve disputed issues. That makes sense, doesn't it? But we perhaps may not have thought of it this way. So if we know that the purpose of medical research is to help resolve disputed issues, then we know that medical research is unnecessary if it doesn't assist in the resolution of the. So then we know that medical research is unnecessary if it doesn't assist in the resolution of a dispute. And we know that medical research is not necessary to research issues that are not in dispute. Okay? Makes sense. So if medical research is used to help us resolve disputed issues, then it follows that the relevant facts and the key data that we unearth through the use of our medical research, those relevant facts and those key data points help us to qualify our opinions and conclusions on disputed issues as substantial medical evidence. Isn't that interesting? So the purpose of medical research is to help you qualify your opinions as substantial opinions in the resolution of disputed issues. So this opens up a whole new world of opportunity for us to use medical research to qualify our opinions and conclusions as substantial medical evidence. And so for that reason, it's my suggestion and recommendation to you that when you do medical research, you cite at least three references that you're able to obtain and discover that support your opinion and conclusion. When you can support your opinions and conclusions with three references from the medical literature and from medical research and medical citations, then certainly that qualifies your opinion as substantial medical evidence. So I'm suggesting that you open your mind to new opportunities to use medical research anytime it could possibly help you in the resolution of a disputed issue. Okay? And so that brings us to today's discussion. And today we're in session number 6. Now, up until now, we've sort of discussed these ideas philosophically and intellectually. And I've received many calls from my subscriber doctors asking me, well, that all sounds very good, Dr. Perry. That all sounds good. But how would that look and how is that done? And how do I prove the complexity factors within the body of my report? So I thought today it would be a good idea to go to the computer and pull up an actual report and construct the report in such a way that it proves the complexity factors exactly as it's required under California Code of Regulations 9795. CCR 9795 gives us exact instructions as to how we prove the complexity factors within the body of our report. And so that's what we're going to do today. We're going to follow the letter of the law in constructing a separate section in the body of our report that proves beyond a shadow of any doubt that this report qualifies for each of the complexity factors for which it's being billed, and therefore that this report deserves and that you demand to be paid for every dollar billed. So we're going to go down to the computer and we're going to do a screen share on the computer, and I'm going to pull up an actual report and we're going to construct this separate section together. So I look forward to being back with you here in just a very few moments as we continue with our ongoing series entitled Prove the Complexity Factors, and I'll meet you down at the computer in just a very few moments. Hi, it's Dr. Carpenter back with you here at the computer now. And I want to go over several things with you in today's discussion. The first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go over California Code of Regulations 9795. And I'm going to pull it right up here on the computer screen so that you can see for your own eyes the language of the law as it's currently written. Now, the language of the law as it's currently written may change, but regardless of whatever those changes may entail, it's all going to be roughly the same in the end. And what's essential is that you construct your report in such a way that you prove to the parties that your use of the complexity factors complies and qualifies to be reimbursed. So that begins with following the instructions as they're described in CCR 9795. And then I want to contrast the instructions as they're written in CCR 9795 with a couple of actual reports written by qualified medical evaluators who did not comply with the instructions of CCR 9795. And I have two separate reports from two separate qualified medical evaluators so that you can see examples of how the complexity factors are being misused by our colleagues, by qualified medical evaluators in the field. And once we have that established, I'm going to share with you a template that you can use in establishing your own separate section at the beginning of your own report so that you can begin to build the case for your compliance with CCR 9795 and your case that your use of the complexity factor deserves to be reimbursed and fully reimbursed without downcoding and without scrutiny. Okay, so let's go to CCR 9795 and see what it has to say about our separate section at the beginning of our report. Okay, so here we are. We're at California Code of Regulations 9795. As you can see up here in our search bar, we're on the Division of Workers' Compensation's website here, and I hope you're reasonably familiar with CCR 9795. If you're not, I suggest that you read this document 10 times. Read it 10 times and absorb the many nuances and subtleties that are contained throughout these descriptions of the complexity factors. So with regards to our discussion today, we're talking about how to prove the complexity factors. And the instructions to do that are clearly given to us here under the ML103 and ML104 codes. And notice here it says clearly, it says in a separate section at the beginning of the report, the physician shall clearly and concisely specify which of the following complexity factors were required for the evaluation, comma, and the circumstances which made these complexity factors applicable to the evaluation. So this is a set of two parts of instructions. Our instructions are, number one, we shall clearly and concisely specify which of the complexity factors were required. And then number two, we're to clearly and concisely specify the circumstances which made these complexity factors applicable to the evaluation. And this exact language is reiterated under the ML104, which requires that when we use the ML104-1 complexity factor, that we are, again, to create a separate section at the beginning of our report where we clearly and concisely specify the complexity factors, and we clearly and concisely specify the circumstances. Now, let me ask you a question. If the instructions require 2 steps, and you are a claims administrator, and you received a billing wherein the qualified medical evaluator provided, let's say only step number 1, meaning that the qualified medical evaluator simply listed the complexity factors that were required, but did not list their circumstances which made the complexity factors applicable to the evaluation. Let me ask you, if you were the claims administrator, would you reimburse for that complexity factor? I can tell you what, I wouldn't, and I bet you wouldn't as well. And this is not too much of a stretch of the imagination. I'm sure you've come across circumstances in your regular non-professional life where you receive an invoice for services or products rendered, and you look at the itemization on the invoice, and as you review the itemization and the charges for each of the line items, you probably go through a mental exercise in your mind where you ask yourself, well, what was the necessity of that? What was the necessity of that? And what was the necessity of that charge? You see, this is something that we sort of naturally do as consumers in the marketplace. We ask ourselves, what is this charge? And what is the necessity of this charge? And I bet you, as a consumer in the marketplace, you scrutinize every single invoice that you get. I know I do, and I bet you do as well. Well, guess what? The claims administrators, they do as well. They don't just throw out payments and checks for line item billings that are unjustified. Well, here CCR tells us how it is that we are to justify our charges. We do it through a two-step process. We create a separate section at the beginning of the report. We clearly and concisely specify the complexity factors that we used in the report, and we cite the circumstances which made these complexity factors applicable to the evaluation. So let me show you a couple of examples where qualified medical evaluators either incompletely or only partly satisfied this two-step requirement. And then I'll show you how to satisfy both steps of this requirement in your own actual separate section. Okay, so here we are, and we have an actual report here. This is Qualified Medical Evaluation Report. And let's just see how well this doctor complies with the exact instructions provided in CCR 9795. So this is page 1 of the report. If we scroll down somewhere near the beginning of the report, we should see a separate section. And the first reference to anything is that this paragraph states that the following report contains my opinions and conclusions, but it doesn't elaborate on any of the complexity factors. Well, from there, the report then goes into the history and then in the review of records, and it seems to me that the separate section is perhaps missing. So let's scroll down in this report, and actually we're going to scroll to the end of the report to see if maybe the end of the report contains any useful information about the complexity factors. And lo and behold, here right before the doctor's signature, the doctor makes some reference to his time involved with the various activities. Now, nowhere here does the doctor cite which of the medical legal fee codes, one of the ML codes he's using. He doesn't describe an ML 103 or an ML 104. He simply describes 2 hours and 10 minutes of face-to-face time, 10 hours of review of records time, 2 hours 20 minutes of medical research time, and 3 hours of report preparation time, for a total of 17 hours and 30 minutes. So let me ask you, if you were the claims administrator, would you pay this report in its entirety? Let's see, 17 and a half hours. If this was a bona fide ML 104 report, that would come in at $4,375. Now, if you were the claims administrator, would you pay $4,375 for this evaluation? I can tell you that I wouldn't, because this doctor did not comply with the requirements of CCR 9795. First of all, this is not even at the beginning of the report. Number 2, he doesn't describe these as complexity factors. For example, we know that report preparation is not a complexity factor. So he doesn't describe his use of the complexity factors. He doesn't say which complexity factors were necessary. And he certainly doesn't explain why any of these charges were necessary for the completion of the evaluation. So if I was the claims administrator, I certainly would not pay for this report. Well, let's see if we have another example of a report. Okay, so here's another report. Of course, it's been redacted, and this one has a little bit different layout than the first, but this is an actual report, and this is page 1 of the report here. And again, under the introduction section, there is some mention here as to face-to-face time, where the doctor cites face-to-face start time and face-to-face stop time, but he does not describe this as a complexity factor. He then goes on to talk about a driver's license number, and then he makes a reference here as to the complexity of the evaluation. He states that in addition to the face-to-face time with the examinee, due to numerous body parts to evaluate, due to preparation of the report, including 3/4 of an hour for record review, 2 hours of typing, the total was in excess of 6 hours. Doesn't say how much in excess, whether it was a minute or whether it was an hour or what, and nowhere here is there a description of any complexity factors. Again, we know that report preparation is not a complexity factor. We know that numerous body parts is not a complexity factor. We know that typing is not a complexity factor. So again, there's no description of the complexity factors. There's no use of a medical legal billing code such as ML103 or ML104. And if we scroll to the end of this report, we can see that, again, the doctor provides his signature on the last page, and again, there is no reference to the exact billing that this report is being submitted under, and there's no description of the complexity factors. So these are actual examples that doctors submitted as completed reports to the claims administrator. And I don't know about you, but if I received this report, I would not pay for it, because nowhere here in the report is the report asking me to pay any particular complexity factor or any particular sum of money. So now that we know a couple of examples of how not to do our qualified medical evaluation reports, let's take a look at an example where the complexity factors do comply with the exact language as described under CCR 9795. Okay, so here we have another actual report. All the names have been redacted, but this is an actual report. And let me just point out a couple of suggestions for you. After the demographic data, which is here in a table format, I suggest that you include a photo of the examinee. The photo of the examinee serves many purposes, not the least of which is to prove that you actually met with the examinee on the date of the scheduled evaluation. I've had cases before where the claims administrator disputed whether or not I actually met face-to-face with the examinee, and certainly a photo on the day of the evaluation goes a long way toward establishing your credibility that indeed you met with the examinee on the given day, date, and time. So always include a picture of the examinee and put their identifying information underneath it, including the date that the photo was taken. Okay, so then we get into the introductory section of the report here. And then very quickly within the third paragraph is where we begin our separate section elaborating on the complexity factors. So let's just go through this very carefully. It says, in compliance with CCR 9795, this report is being submitted as an ML 104. So here we disclose to the parties the billing level at which we expect to be paid. An ML 104 is a comprehensive medical legal evaluation involving the following complexity factors. So here we elaborate on the complexity factors that were required for the evaluation, and we elaborate upon the necessity of these complexity factors for the evaluation. Number 1, 2 or more hours of face-to-face time by the physician with the injured worker. Well, here we now go on to prove face-to-face time as a complexity factor. It says total face-to-face time with Mrs. Jones was 246 minutes, which is 4.1 hours. See the enclosed examinee timesheet, which documents face-to-face start time at 9:30 a.m. and face-to-face stop time at 1:36 p.m. for a total face-to-face time of 4.1 hours, and this document is initialed by Mrs. Jones. So this, in addition to a photograph, seals the deal and proves that the examinee actually attended on the specified day, date, and time. And this examinee timesheet is simply a check sheet that I use to make sure that I complete all of the necessary procedures during the face-to-face evaluation, and it simply includes a space on the bottom for me to write in the face-to-face start time and write in the face-to-face stop time with lines next to each of these times where the examinee can place their initials. And then once you have this document initialed, it becomes a document which can prove the actual face-to-face time. Number 2, 2 or more hours of review of records by the physician. See below, under review of records, a listing and summary of the records that were received, that were reviewed, and that I relied upon in the formulation of this report. Total time involved with the review of records was 183 minutes, which is 3.05 hours. And we'll go over the review of records section, the actual section in the body of the report, here in just a couple minutes. Number 3, and this is actually a combination complexity factor. It says 6 or more hours spent on any combination of 3 complexity factors, such as review of records, such as face-to-face time, such as medical research, which shall count as 3 complexity factors. Total time involved with face-to-face was 246 minutes. Review of records was 183 minutes. Medical research was 128 minutes, for a total of 557 minutes, which is 9.28 hours, well above the 6-hour minimum requirement for this complexity factor. Now remember that when we use medical research, we're required to provide a list of citations to the references that we used. So here I explained to the parties the medical research, what it consisted of, and also what was the necessity of incorporating medical research into this evaluation. Well, it says medical research consisted of an inquiry into, number 1, in this case, the association of methamphetamine use with symptoms of chest pain, shortness of breath, high blood pressure, and heart palpitations, and those are all symptoms that this examinee presented to the emergency department with. And number 2, the association of methamphetamine use and laboratory findings of elevated white blood cell count, leukocytosis, as discovered in Mrs. Jones' emergency room visit on 8/24. And then I reference the review of records document so that the reader can go right to this section in the review of records and see what the heck we're talking about when we're referring to leukocytosis. And the medical research contributes to and supports the opinions and conclusions of this report. Medical research included the following citations, and so here we provide a list of the citations that comprise our medical research, and then here, the last bullet point, we refer the reader of the report to the section in the report wherein the medical research is discussed. So it's not necessary to discuss the medical research here in this separate section at the beginning of your report. In the beginning of your report, you simply want to document your medical research, document the necessity of the medical research, and give a listing of your citations and references, and then refer the parties to the section in the report wherein you discuss the medical research. Now, you can bet that the parties are going to go to this section on page 30 and see if your use of medical research actually qualifies as a complexity factor. So this section of your report better be a fabulous section of your report. Okay, and guess what? We're not done. We have an additional complexity factor here that is involved in this report, and that has to do with medical causation. Now remember, the medical causation complexity factor simply states addressing the issue of medical causation upon written request of the party or parties requesting the report. So if you receive a written request from the party or parties, why not cite the written request? Why not provide the written request? Why not show the parties your authority for invoking the causation complexity factor in your report? And here's one way to do it. Here we cite our authority. We cite the 10/13/17 cover letter, which we include a copy, enclose a copy, from Betty Lou Williams of the ABC Insurance Company requests. And here we cite the written request. She says that the insurance company has denied liability. The purpose of your evaluation is to determine AOE-COE. She's alleging injuries to her back and shoulders. If you find that applicant has sustained an industrial injury, please address which body parts were injured and provide an analysis of your conclusions. So these are the causation questions extracted from the cover letter. So here we show the parties our authority for using and invoking causation as a complexity factor. And we enclose a copy of this cover letter with our QME report. And then finally we refer the reader to the page of the report wherein we discuss and answer these particular questions that are disputed issues with the parties. Okay? So in this report we have face-to-face time complexity factor, review of records complexity factor, we have medical research complexity factor, and we also have causation as a complexity factor. So let's just very briefly go through each of these, and let me show you how these sections look within the body of the report. Okay? So here's the review of records section of the report. If you remember, the review of records is governed by 4 laws, 2 labor codes and 2 codes of regulation. And within these labor codes and codes of regulation, we learn exactly what it is that's required of us in doing our review of records. Basically, between the 4 of these laws, they require that we list and summarize the records that we received, that we reviewed, and that we relied upon in the formulation of our opinions and conclusions within the body of the report. So I always suggest that the review of records be organized in a table format because it's pleasing to the eye. The records should be listed in chronologic order. Can you believe I sometimes see records listed in random, non-chronologic order? But they should be listed in chronologic order so that the reader can get a sense of how the events unfolded in real time. So here's a table with all the review of records. And then note here that the last citation in the review of records is the citation involving the medical research. Since the medical research contributed to the opinions and conclusions of the report, I list here for the readers of the report wherein that medical research was obtained. And these are the specific references related to the medical research. Okay, so now we get down into the causation section of the report. So here is the causation section. And again, we cite our authority for invoking the causation complexity factor by reiterating the questions that were asked in the cover letter. So these are the causation questions that are in dispute and that the claims administrator wants us to answer. So we cite the questions and then we simply provide the answer. See, they hired us to answer these questions, so give them the answer. In this case, the answer was no. In my opinion and within reasonable medical probability, the current symptoms described by Mrs. Jones involving her cervical spine, thoracic spine, left shoulder, and lumbar spine are not due to an industrial injury with the vineyard for date of injury 8/24, and then I give the reasons for this conclusion. Now, this is the causation section of the report. Causation is a complexity factor. You've heard me say many times that this section of the report should be a masterpiece. It should be fabulous. It should be thorough. So let's take a look at these answers and these explanations that support the answer, and I want to ask you if you would consider this to be a thorough discussion of causation. So here I start to cite the reasons for the conclusion. She was a vague historian. She was unclear about the mechanism of injury. There was a delay in reporting of the injury. She was vague during the evaluation. She was not clear as to the parts of her body. This was an unwitnessed incident. There was a delay in reporting. And look at the lengthy discussion in detail as to explain each one of these reasons that support the opinion against industrial causation. There was a contradictory history. She has a history of non-industrial conditions. So look at the length of this discussion. This discussion goes on to several pages. This is the third page. And then finally, we invoke the medical research and make reference to the medical research within this same section of the report. So this medical research is contained within the causation section of the report because the medical research is going to support the opinion and conclusion on causation. So in order to understand the significance of the findings related to Mrs. Jones' symptoms and any possible association of those symptoms to methamphetamine use, medical research was necessary. The findings of the medical research support the opinions and conclusions of this report, and that is that Mrs. Jones has suffered symptoms related to methamphetamine use, but falsely imputes those symptoms to a musculoskeletal injury with the vineyard. Important conclusions from the research that I conducted as relates to Mrs. Jones include, and here you list the reference that you used and the conclusions that you derived from that reference that relate to the examinee and relate to the conclusions that you provide related to that examinee. So here are many important points. Here's the next reference. Here are many important points from that reference. Here is the third reference. And here are many important points related to Mrs. Jones. For example, the most widely reported adverse effects of methamphetamine use are chest pain, as in the case of Mrs. Jones, tachycardia, as in the case of Mrs. Jones, and other cardiac arrhythmias, shortness of breath and high blood pressure, as in the case of Mrs. Jones, and I relate the medical research to the examinee in question, which all supports the final opinion and conclusion that for the reasons above, it is my opinion that Mrs. Jones did not suffer industrial injury as alleged, but rather her symptoms were due to non-industrial factors. So we first create a separate section at the beginning of our report. Within that separate section, in the beginning of the report, we refer the reader to the section of the report wherein that discussion is contained. And then when we get to that particular section in the report, we do a fabulous and thorough discussion of the disputed issues. So doctors, I hope this gives you some idea as to the effort that's required in proving your use of the complexity factors. Really, the sections of your report that deal with the complexity factors are the sections of your report upon which you need to give your greatest attention and your greatest intellectual effort. Similarly, these sections of your report need to be beautifully formatted, need to be perfectly proofread, need to be syntactically and grammatically perfect. In other words, these sections of your report should clearly demonstrate your effort to the parties in documenting that your use of this complexity factors was necessary for the completion of your evaluation, and this complexity factor deserves to be reimbursed in its entirety, in full, without downcoding and without scrutiny of any kind from any authoritative body. So the instructions to us are quite clear. We're to create a separate section in the beginning of our report. In the separate section, we're to elaborate on which of the complexity factors were required for the evaluation. And once we've done those two things, we're not done. We then have to explain to the parties, just as you would want to explain to you when looking at any invoice, we're to explain to the parties why those complexity factors were necessary for the evaluation. Now, I don't know about you, but I think we should provide the claims administrators a little bit of slack and a little bit of compassion in paying for these qualified medical evaluation reports, which are multi-$1,000 reports. Now, I don't know about you, but in my daily life, in my personal life, when I'm confronted with a multi-$1,000 bill, I always require that the vendor who's billing me for multi-$1,000 gets a head nod from me in advance of those charges. I would never pay a multi-$1,000 invoice without first giving the vendor a green light, go ahead, to perform those services and to apply those charges to my invoice. Now, there is a corollary with our qualified medical evaluation reports, and that has to do with the prior written agreement. The prior written agreement is a circumstance where we give the claims administrator an opportunity to give us a green light, to give us a go-ahead, to authorize the use of any and all complexity factors required for the evaluation. But in most cases, our claims administrators are being required to pay these evaluation reports in arrears after the services have been rendered and after the invoices have already been created, with no opportunity to authorize or give a green light head nod for the use of any charges at all. So we need to be a little bit considerate of the claims administrator, and at least for the complexity factors that we are billing and the complexity factors that we are citing, we need to be thorough in documenting to the claims administrator in arrears that those complexity factors were not only necessary for the evaluation, but they were required, and explain why they were required, and then do a fabulous job on using those complexity factors to provide your opinions and conclusions within the body of your report. So doctors, I hope this helps you. Many doctors have been disciplined for accusations of misuse and abuse of the complexity factors, and it's my opinion that if you follow the exact instructions as are described in CCR 95 and you provide a separate section in the beginning of your report, as we demonstrated here in today's video, you will stay clear of scrutiny and you will actually qualify for reimbursement for each of the complexity factors that you bill for. You know, this separate section of the report actually is not meant to penalize us or provide us with additional unnecessary labor-intensive work, but rather this separate section excuse me, actually serves us because it helps us prove to the parties why we should be paid for our evaluation report. So I hope this helps you, and I hope you take these suggestions to heart in your very next evaluation. So in our next session, we're going to go over some fascinating findings through independent bill review. And I'm going to share with you how independent bill review looks at our use of complexity factors in those cases where medical legal reports and the billing for medical legal reports has either been denied or been downcoded by the claims administrator. And you're going to find this to be quite enlightening, that independent bill review, they take a hard and accurate look at the complexity factors that we bill for, and frequently and without remorse at all, frequently downcode doctors' QME reports. So that's going to be tremendously insightful for you as well. And that will conclude this series on proving the complexity factors. So for today, this is Dr. Perry Carpenter. It's been my pleasure to be with you here on today's discussion. Look forward to being with you on our very next discussion as well. And for now, I wish you the best of success in your career as a qualified medical